Daenerys Targaryen stood atop the scorched battlements of King's Landing, the winds of fate swirling around her like restless spirits. Though the city's bells had rung, signaling surrender, she had paused in the crucial moment and decided, by an impulse she herself could not fully explain, to show mercy. Her heart had pounded with the memory of betrayal, loss, and the searing vision of a realm she intended to reshape. But in the end, she had not unleashed dragonfire upon the helpless citizens below. Instead, she commanded Drogon to land. The mighty beast roared, black wings casting a colossal shadow over the charred city walls, where pockets of flame still crackled from the final skirmish. The Lannister soldiers who survived the onslaught now laid down their weapons, trembling at the silver-haired queen who had, for once, chosen restraint. Her advisors gathered at the foot of the battered Red Keep, gazing up at her with guarded expressions. Tyrion Lannister stood with one hand across his chest, relief washing over his features in a fleeting wave. He had seen the fury in her eyes and had feared she would become the very thing she once loathed, a tyrant, the breaker of chains turned destroyer of innocence. But she had not, and he found a shred of hope amid the rubble. Jon Snow, his brow furrowed, watched Daenerys with the inscrutable gaze he had worn since he arrived in the capital. There was respect in his eyes, but also concern. He had tried to talk her down when the bells rang, urging her that the city had surrendered, and now he silently thanked the gods that she had indeed listened to her better angels. Daenerys lowered herself from Drogon's saddle, her silver hair in disarray from the heat and the wildness of battle. Grey Worm approached, spear in hand, eyes still hot with the memory of Missandei's unjust execution. His loyalty to Daenerys never wavered, but a flicker of confusion crossed his face as he recognized that the city still stood, battered, but not burned to the ground. He was torn between his thirst for vengeance and the vow he had made to serve his queen's every command. Yet he bowed to her, the tips of his blood-stained spear tapping the ground, and said nothing. The air smelled of death and smoke, but also of fragile possibility. Across the ruined streets, countless refugees cowered behind collapsed buildings, uncertain if the worst had truly passed. The screams of the dying mingled with the crackle of smoldering remains. Daenerys felt their fear ripple through the air, and she realized the power in her hands. She realized how close she had come to obliterating them all with a single word. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat, then stepped forward into the ashes. Her boots crunched shards of broken stone and scattered the last remnants of charred cloth. In a patch of sunlight that filtered through drifting smoke, her eyes landed on Jaime Lannister's body. He lay to the side, near the collapsed entrance to the Red Keep's lower levels, pinned beneath a massive slab of fallen masonry. His eyes were closed, and the once shining gold of his hair was dull with dust. Next to him lay Cersei, her exquisite gown of crimson and gold now torn and stained with ash. Daenerys had expected them both dead from the rubble that collapsed upon them. But as she drew closer, she discovered a startling thing. Cersei yet lived, though her breath was shallow and her face contorted with pain. It was unclear if Jaime was gone entirely, his chest unmoving and eyes vacant, or if he clung to a shred of life. But Cersei's eyelids fluttered. Tyrion hurried forward, worry contorting his usually measured face. He dropped to one knee beside Cersei. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and her right leg was twisted at a terrible angle. She flinched at his touch, tried to speak, but only managed a faint croak of pain. Daenerys observed them quietly, her heart throbbing with an unfamiliar mixture of pity and revulsion. If anyone deserved to answer for her crimes, it was Cersei Lannister. She had taken everything from so many, not only from Daenerys but from the entire realm. Yet the Mother of Dragons could see in Tyrion's posture that he still loved his sister in some small, complicated way, no matter what horrors she had committed. Grey Worm's voice cut through the hush. "Shall I end her now, my queen?" His spear trembled at the request, as though vengeance itself yearned to spill the last Lannister blood. Daenerys found herself hesitating. That old fury seethed in her veins, whispering that Cersei's death would be justice. Cersei had murdered Missandei, orchestrated Ned Stark's downfall all those years ago, decimated the realm with the Great War for her own pride, and orchestrated betrayals too numerous to count. But a gentle gust of wind seemed to carry the memory of her advisor's pleas. Tyrion urging mercy, Jon's stoic warnings, Ser Davos's quiet remarks about preserving humanity in a time of war. She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the reasons she had come here in the first place. To break the wheel, to bring a new era of justice and peace, to free the people from tyrants, not to become one herself. "No," Daenerys said softly. "We will not kill her here, helpless in the street." Those around her exchanged uncertain glances, for the Queen's pronouncement was wholly unexpected. "We will take her into custody. She will stand trial for her crimes." Her words fell with surprising weight, carving a new path in the chaotic aftermath. Grey Worm nodded stiffly. Tyrion pressed his lips together, torn between relief and sorrow. He knew that Cersei's survival likely meant a slow reckoning rather than a quick end. For a moment, he let himself believe that maybe in the course of a fair trial, some form of justice or truth would reveal itself. Or perhaps he simply wanted to see that at the end, everything Cersei had done would be laid bare before the realm she had tormented. Jon Snow stepped forward, glancing at Daenerys with a trace of admiration. He had feared the worst. Now he saw the woman he had once loved, compassionate, wise, determined to bring not terror but justice. And yet, the wariness in Jon's eyes did not fade entirely. War had taught him that the line between mercy and ruthlessness was perilously thin, and he worried for his queen's soul. For now, however, hope stirred in him. "I will see to it that she receives proper treatment," Jon offered. "She might still die from these injuries unless we get her the help of a maester." They worked together, an uneasy collective. Tyrion, Jon, Ser Davos, and a group of Unsullied carefully prying away the debris. Jaime lay completely still, his face drained of color, but as they lifted the slab from his torso, it became heartbreakingly clear he had drawn his last breath. Tyrion pressed a hand to his brother's cheek in a silent farewell, while Jon moved around to check for any trace of a heartbeat. None remained. When Tyrion placed 2 fingers on Jaime's eyelids to close them, tears glistened in his eyes. Daenerys observed from a short distance, sensing the quiet finality that settled around them. Cersei let out a feeble gasp as they hoisted her onto a makeshift stretcher. Blood coated her mouth, and her leg was twisted almost grotesquely. The agony in her expression was overshadowed by a flickering rage. Even now, she managed to glare at Daenerys, a silent vow of hatred etched behind half-closed lids. "Grey Worm," Daenerys said, her voice wavering slightly. "Put her in chains and take her to the Red Keep. She will be given a room guarded by our men, and a maester will tend to her wounds." "Understood." Grey Worm hesitated for half a heartbeat, but Daenerys's calm authority was undeniable. "Yes, Your Grace." As they moved through the torn streets, Tyrion tried to catch Cersei's eye, but her gaze darted away, focusing instead on nothing, as if she would rather see no one. The column of Unsullied and Northmen parted crowds of war-weary citizens. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, men gripped makeshift crutches, and old women stared with hollow eyes. Even though Daenerys had not unleashed the full fury of dragonfire upon them, King's Landing still bore the scars of war. Broken towers, charred hovels, smashed wagons. Corpses on every corner that no one had yet had the spirit or strength to move. But there was also a strange hush of relief, like a city waking from a nightmare to find itself half alive. Word spread quickly. The Dragon Queen had spared the city. Rumors rippled through the alleys, stories of how Daenerys Targaryen might indeed be different from her father, the Mad King. Some recounted how she had broken the chains of slaves in Essos and soared with her dragons to liberate cities from tyrannical rule. Others warned that only a fool would trust the Targaryen bloodline. But no matter what side one leaned toward, there was no denying that the city still stood. The people were battered and afraid, but not annihilated in a fiery storm. By the time they reached the Red Keep's gates, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The walls were scarred from the battle, blackened in places where Drogon's fire had grazed them. A sense of stunned upheaval weighed over everyone. The war had ended. Cersei was dethroned, her armies defeated, and Daenerys Targaryen had claimed King's Landing without resorting to indiscriminate carnage. Now the question on every face was, what next? Inside the Red Keep's courtyard, the wounded were being carried in, and healers rushed about. Piles of battered Lannister armor lay to one side, stripped from those who had surrendered. Daenerys dismounted from Drogon fully. Grey Worm had insisted she not walk from the battlefield unguarded, and walked with her advisors to a broad antechamber near the throne room. The walls within were cracked, and rubbled columns had fallen across the floor. Everything echoed with the tension of shifting alliances. Without ceremony, they carried Cersei deeper into the keep, placing her in a modest chamber that once belonged to a lesser noble. The bed was narrow, the furnishings sparse. A single window overlooked the battered courtyard. A bald maester arrived, a man from Old Town who had once served the Lannisters but now bowed to Daenerys' rightful claim. He assured them he would do what he could to set Cersei's broken bones and staunch the internal bleeding, but her fate would depend on her will to live and the gods' mercy. Cersei said nothing as they worked on her. She would occasionally let out a hiss of pain, her eyes fixed on the door, as if trying to memorize every detail of her captivity. Daenerys pulled Tyrion aside. Her expression was weary, her voice guarded. She will stand trial, just as I said. The realm will see that I do not slaughter a defeated enemy without due cause. She paused, searching his face. But she will face a reckoning. The things she has done. Tyrion nodded solemnly. You are making the choice my brother would have wanted. One that spares the innocent while still demanding justice. But the realm will be looking for a decisive statement, Your Grace. Some may question your mercy if you do not make it clear why you chose this path. Daenerys sighed. Her shoulders, once proud and poised, slumped under the weight of responsibility. I know. I will address the people soon. But let them see what we are doing here. Let them see that the rightful queen does not hide behind violence alone. Let them see a just queen, not a conqueror drenched in blood. The Lannisters gave the realm fear. I must give them hope, or we will never rise above the ashes of this war. The next hours bled into a long, anxious night. Daenerys and Jon toured the city, or what was left of it, accompanied by guards. The people, exhausted and traumatized, offered little in the way of open hostility, though some eyed them warily, uncertain if the Targaryen queen's mercy was genuine. Daenerys ordered the distribution of bread and water from the Red Keep stores, though they were meager. She commanded that the wounded, no matter their allegiance, be treated if possible. She directed Grey Worm to post unsullied at strategic points, not to terrorize the citizens, but to maintain order amidst the chaos. Firelight danced against the shattered walls of the city, mingling with the deep shadows of night. A hush settled, punctuated by the groans of the injured and the distant sobs of the grieving. Now and then, a voice would rise, celebrating that the Dragon Queen had not razed the entire city. Others cursed her under their breath, attributing the destruction to her dragons, pointing out that many had still died. The narrative of who was villain and who was savior was still in flux. Jon Snow found Daenerys at dawn, standing on a high balcony overlooking King's Landing. The new sun's rays illuminated the cityscape, revealing the full extent of the devastation. Smoke still curled from broken rooftops. Towers that had stood for centuries now lay in heaps. A hush blanketed the city, a momentary truce between sorrow and rebuilding. He touched her shoulder gently. I'm glad you didn't do it, he murmured. When the bells rang, I was terrified you'd. He couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of that tension gripped him. She turned, her eyes reflecting the weariness of her soul. I was so close, Jon, she whispered. For a moment, I could feel the rage of everything that was taken from me. My family's throne, my friends, my children, my dragons. She shook her head. But I remembered who I am. I'm not here just to destroy. I'm here to free. He nodded, a subtle relief warming his normally brooding face. That you are. The people will remember this, even if it takes time for them to trust again. And we'll see that Cersei stands trial. You'll show the realm there's a better way." She exhaled, her breath shaky. "I hope so. I truly do." The following days were a blur of logistical efforts. Tyrion coordinated supply lines from the surrounding farms, encouraging lords and small folk outside the city to bring aid if possible. Though many were cautious, uncertain if they would be robbed or if this Targaryen queen was a threat. Food was running short, and the city was at risk of disease from unburied corpses. Daenerys made it her mission to lead, to show that the war was truly over, and that healing must begin. She walked through the devastated markets, listening to the pleas of beggars. She commissioned the Unsullied to clear rubble from the main thoroughfares so that carts of supplies could travel freely. She urged the Northmen to stand guard in shifts, ensuring that no crimes against the vulnerable occurred. In each act, she repeated the vow to break the wheel of oppression, to usher in a new era. Grey Worm was restless. Vengeance still simmered in his blood, and he ached to see justice done for Missandei. Though he obeyed Daenerys' orders to maintain peace, he made no secret of his desire for a swift and merciless end to Cersei. Daenerys, aware of this tension, reaffirmed her decision each time they spoke. She needed him and the Unsullied to enforce her rule, but she would not reduce herself to slaughter when a fair trial was within reach. Grey Worm, for all his loyalty, wore his anger like a second skin. Meanwhile, Cersei clung to life. The maester that attended her worried that infection could claim her soon. He used every poultice and tincture he had left to stave off fever, but her condition teetered on the edge. She spent most of her days unconscious or in a haze of medication that dulled her pain. Tyrion visited her once, quietly, while she lay half awake. He whispered that he was sorry for everything. Her eyes had flickered open, and she rasped something he couldn't decipher. He thought it might have been Jaime's name. Then she fell back into darkness. Each day brought new stability to the city, but also new problems. Winter still lingered, though the worst of it had passed since the defeat of the Night King. Refugees poured in from the countryside, hoping the city would be safer now that Cersei was gone. It was a paradox. So many had fled the city's war, yet now, ironically, they flooded back, drawn by the promise of Targaryen rule. A queen they hoped would bring relief rather than subjugation. Daenerys did all she could to accommodate them, but the resources were limited. She tasked Tyrion with gathering gold from the royal treasury. Much was spent on essential supplies, and to pay for laborers to begin repairs. At length, after a week's time, word began to spread through the Seven Kingdoms. The Mad Queen rumor had proven false. King's Landing still stood, and Daenerys Targaryen had captured Cersei Lannister alive. Many lords and ladies who had once feared the Targaryen name dared to send envoys to the capital to observe the situation. Some came out of curiosity, others to curry favor with the new ruling power. Sansa Stark, though she remained in the north, sent a raven acknowledging Daenerys' triumph. She expressed neither condemnation nor praise, merely a cautious acceptance, knowing full well that her brother-cousin, in truth, Jon Snow, stood at Daenerys' side. The lords of the Reach, still reeling from the devastation of the wars, hesitated to commit openly, but the corners of Westeros stirred with new possibility. As the days passed, Cersei's strength wavered, but she did not die. With her returning lucidity came waves of anger and cold resignation. She spoke little, acknowledging only the maester's questions. When Daenerys visited her on the second week after the city's fall, she found Cersei sitting up in bed, her leg in a cast, her face pale but her eyes bright with hatred. The bed was surrounded by 4 unsullied guards who never left their posts. Daenerys stood in the doorframe, quietly observing the once queen regent of the Seven Kingdoms. Cersei's golden hair was matted, unkempt, and she wore a plain nightgown. No longer did she have the fine silks and jewels. The iron crown she had taken when she proclaimed herself queen was nowhere to be seen. "You're here to gloat, I suppose?" Cersei said in a cracked voice. "Is that what passes for mercy from the Dragon Queen?" Daenerys advanced into the chamber, stopping a few feet from the bed. She studied the lines of grief and malice etched into Cersei's face. "No, Daenerys replied evenly. "I'm here to confirm you are well enough to stand trial." Cersei gave a mirthless laugh. "And to think I used to dream of how I might watch your head mounted on a spike. Now the roles are reversed. How quaint." Daenerys's gaze flickered with emotion. Anger, pity, perhaps even a sliver of empathy for a woman who had lost almost everything. "I promised a trial. I don't execute the wounded in their bed." Cersei's lip curled. "I suppose that's supposed to be a virtue. Very well. If it's a spectacle you want, you'll have it. When do I stand before your court of fools?" Daenerys turned to leave. "When the realm can assemble its witnesses, you will be tried by a council. The people deserve to hear what you have done." Cersei grimaced, shifting in bed. Pain lanced across her features, but the intensity of her glare did not soften. "I've done what any queen would do to protect her children, her throne, her house. If I have to die, I will die as a Lannister." Daenerys paused at the threshold. "Perhaps you will, but you'll die a prisoner first." With that, she left the room, her heart pounding with a swirl of conflicting emotions. Soon enough, the preparations for Cersei's trial began in earnest. Tyrion oversaw the logistical aspects, gathering lords and knights willing to preside over the proceeding. He wanted it to be recognized by the realm as fair and legitimate, not a mere show trial. The council would be composed of representatives from various regions: the North, the Vale, the Reach, Dorne, and the Stormlands. None of them had entirely forgiven the Lannisters, nor forgotten the blood of the dragon. But Tyrion was determined to create a semblance of justice that even the history books could not deny. Davos Seaworth played a key role as well, traveling by ship to invite the Prince of Dorne or at least a high-ranking envoy to attend. Dorne had been ravaged by conflicts with the Lannisters, and their willingness to accept Daenerys' new rule was fragile, but they agreed to send a representative. Gendry Baratheon, legitimized by the late king in the north, found himself called upon to speak for the Stormlands, though he was somewhat reluctant, uncertain of his place in these high matters. Sansa Stark sent a delegate to represent the north, choosing the stoic and honorable Lord Royce, who had allied with her since the days of the Vale's intervention in the Battle of the Bastards. Lord Royce had also once served as a guardian of sorts to Robin Arryn, so he was seen as something of a bridge between the North and the Vale. Meanwhile, the Tyrell line was extinguished, leaving the Reach complicated. Various minor houses squabbled among themselves, but eventually, they sent a lesser lord from House Caswell, eager to hold on to legitimacy by aligning themselves with the new queen. Slowly, the Red Keep's Great Hall was transformed, not for a coronation or a feast, but for a trial meant to define the dawn of a new reign. The Iron Throne itself still loomed at the far side, an ugly symbol of Targaryen legacy, forged by Aegon the Conqueror from 1,000 melted swords. Daenerys often paused to gaze upon it, remembering her father's madness, her brother's cruelty, and the vow she had made to be a different kind of ruler. She felt a surge of conflict each time she drew near it. Now, with the city's population straining from the aftermath of war, the throne felt more a burden than a privilege. Nonetheless, she prepared herself to ascend it, if only to oversee the trial. At last, the day came. Though the city remained scarred by the conflict, enough repairs had been made for the Great Hall to host the spectacle. Word had spread far and wide, and a crowd gathered within the keep's courtyard. Guards were doubled at every entrance, determined to prevent any sign of violence. The people, hungry for bread, for peace, and for justice, all crammed together hoping to catch sight of the dethroned queen who had once terrorized them from these very walls. Many recalled the brutality of the faith militant subjugation under Cersei's reign, her use of wildfire in the Great September, her betrayal of alliances. Even so, the city also remembered that war did not vanish with her downfall. The Dragon Queen had come, and though she spared them from total destruction, the sight of Drogon overhead still reminded them of their fragility. Tyrion stood near Daenerys at the front of the hall, face taut with nerves. He wore no Lannister sigil now, only simple attire that marked him as the hand of the queen. Jon Snow stood on Daenerys' other side, the brooding presence that lent some sense of northern alliance and a quiet moral anchor. Grey Worm and his Unsullied fanned out, silent sentinels prepared for any trouble. The herald blew a horn, and a hush fell over the audience. "Bring forth the prisoner," the herald called out. Two Unsullied, each gripping a chain that bound Cersei's wrists, led her down the aisle. She walked gingerly, her legs still healing. The maester's cast remained, forcing her to limp. Her hair was cropped short, growing back slowly from the styling she had once adopted after her own walk of atonement. Her expression remained impassive, though her gaze flicked to the lords and ladies assembled, as if memorizing every face for some future reckoning. The hush in the hall became almost suffocating as she was placed at the center of the room, a single pool of torchlight illuminating her. Daenerys watched from the dais, her posture regal, her eyes stern. She felt a swell of strange empathy. This woman had once wielded power that could make even the mightiest tremble. Now she stood alone and broken, forced to answer for her deeds. There was no satisfaction in Daenerys, only a grim resolve. In a formal tone, the herald recited Cersei's titles, or those she had claimed: Queen of the Undulls and the First Men, Protector of the Realm, blah, blah, blah. Then he read the charges. Regicide, kinslaying in the case of her complicity with Tyrion's near execution, the use of wildfire at the September of Baelor resulting in mass murder, betrayal of alliances during the War for the Dawn, murder of countless innocents, and more. Each charge rang out in the silent hall. Every eye turned to Cersei, whose face hardened with each word. The newly formed council sat in seats arrayed to the right side of the dais. Lord Royce from the North and Vale, the Dornish envoy Lord Corgyle, a representative from the Reach, a stoic older knight from the Stormlands, Gendry Baratheon, and a few others. It was a motley assembly, lacking the pomp of the old days, when the Seven Kingdoms were more firmly united. Yet they each had a vote in the matter of Cersei's guilt or innocence, and they each represented a voice from their corner of Westeros. Tyrion, as Hand of the Queen, would act as one of the primary witnesses and as an advocate for the crown. Cersei stood in the center, her chains clinking softly as she shifted her weight. Her gaze never left Daenerys. When Tyrion stepped forward to present the case against her, she allowed herself a small, bitter smirk. Tyrion cleared his throat. "My lords, my ladies, we stand here today to address crimes committed by Cersei of House Lannister, crimes that have torn the realm asunder. I stand not only as the Hand of the Queen, but also as a witness to many of these deeds." He glanced at his sister. "I loved my family, my father, my brother, my sister, but I cannot condone what Cersei has done. Even a family name cannot wash away the atrocities. We all saw the wildfire that consumed the Great September, killing the High Sparrow, Queen Marjorie Tyrell, and countless others. We have all felt the consequences of her betrayal when she refused to aid in the fight against the Night King, despite pledging her forces." Cersei's smirk tightened, but she said nothing. "Further," Tyrion continued, voice carrying through the hall, "she has lied, manipulated, and tortured her subjects, all to retain power at any cost. She employed mercenaries, the Golden Company, throwing the realm back into a war we could ill afford. Countless have died. We stand in a city battered by a siege, one that could have been avoided had she chosen peace. Instead, she beheaded Missandei of Noth in a public display, provoking the very battle that ended in her defeat." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. The mention of Missandei's beheading brought pained fury to the faces of the Unsullied, and to many others who had come to respect Daenerys' efforts. Daenerys herself felt her chest tighten at the reminder of that brutal moment. When Tyrion finished, silence filled the hall. Daenerys lifted her chin, scanning the council. "The accused will speak." Cersei stepped forward on her injured leg, refusing the crutch she had been offered. She raised her chin, addressing the council as though she were still their queen. Her voice was raspy but unwavering. "I hear these charges, and I will not grovel or plead for my life. Everything I did was for my family. My children were threatened at every turn by traitors, usurpers, and so-called rightful kings and queens. I did what I had to do. Tell me, would any of you have done differently to protect your children? You cannot claim the moral high ground. War is war. Allies shift. Deals are broken. The Tyrells plotted against the Lannisters. The Faith militant threatened the very fabric of monarchy itself. But none of you batted an eye when traitors conspired to overthrow the crown. Some of the lords shifted uncomfortably, recalling the many political machinations of the past decade. But none seemed particularly sympathetic. Cersei turned her scornful gaze to Daenerys. And you, Dragon Queen, you speak of justice and mercy, but you came to these shores with an army of savages and dragons, burning anyone who opposed you. You would have done the same to me if I had not rung the bells. Your father was the Mad King. Your brother, Viserys, was a cruel monster. Don't pretend your blood is clean. Daenerys's expression did not falter. She answered calmly, though her voice shook with barely contained outrage. It is true that my father was mad, that my brother was cruel, but I am neither. You stand alive before me, do you not? If I followed their path, you would have been ashes by now. Cersei's mouth twisted. Then kill me if it makes you sleep better at night. You call this a trial, but we all know how it ends. At least do me the courtesy of admitting you want me dead. Tyrion pressed forward again, before Daenerys could respond. We are not here to decide what Daenerys wants. The Queen has insisted on this trial so that the realm can witness the crimes that have been committed. The question, my lords, my ladies, is whether Cersei's actions warrant her execution or some other sentence. The Dornish envoy spoke first, his voice carrying the memory of Oberyn Martell's bitterness. Dorne has no love for House Lannister. Our people have suffered greatly under their treachery, including the murder of Elia Martell and her children. While that crime lies with the Mountain, the Lannisters have never properly atoned. Today we see just how far the rot has spread. Dorne supports the maximum penalty for Cersei's crimes. Lord Royce of the Vale and the North gave a curt nod. I watched the Watchers on the wall fall, while the capital plotted to betray the living. The North demands justice as well. In the name of all those who died in the Great War, while the Lannisters held their forces back, I vote to condemn her. One by one, the other lords weighed in. Gendry Baratheon, awkward though he was, cleared his throat. I owe House Lannister no love. They destroyed my father's line, murdered Lord Eddard Stark, who was the closest thing I had to a father figure even if I never knew him. But I also know the burden of wearing the crown. My father, Robert Baratheon, was no saint. If I am to speak for the Stormlands, I say that Cersei Lannister has shed innocent blood. She has used wildfire on her own people. This cannot go unpunished. Finally, the representative from the Reach stood. He was a minor lord of House Caswell, an unassuming man with thinning hair. We have lost our guardians, the Tyrells, to the Lannisters' schemes. Queen Marjorie and Lord Mace both died in the flames at the September. That alone demands retribution. But we must ask ourselves, do we follow the same path of bloodshed? Or do we show we are better than that? His eyes flicked to Daenerys. As a man of the Reach, I cannot ignore the severity of these crimes. But I would see a punishment that serves as a lesson to future rulers. Let this be a condemnation so public, so total, that no one ever repeats these atrocities. A hush fell. All eyes turned to Daenerys. She rose from her seat, stepping down from the dais. The council parted, allowing her to stand but a few feet from Cersei. Daenerys could see every line of exhaustion and loathing etched on the woman's face. The hush in the hall was deafening. Daenerys lifted her voice, ensuring all could hear. Cersei Lannister, you have been found guilty of war crimes, betrayal of the realm during its darkest hour, the murder of innocents, and the use of terror through wildfire. The realm unites in this judgment. She paused, letting her words sink in. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. By all accounts, the punishment for these crimes would be death. If I listened to those who have lost so much, I would name you a murderer who deserves no mercy. Cersei's gaze sharpened. She braced herself, as though expecting the next words to seal her doom. Daenerys exhaled slowly, her expression resolute. Yet I remember what it means to be a breaker of chains. I did not come here to replace one tyranny with another, to slaughter helpless foes. There has been too much death already. The realm needs peace. And so, in the name of justice and mercy, and by the power vested in me as the rightful queen of the Undulls and the First Men, I pronounce this sentence. Cersei Lannister, you are to spend the rest of your life in exile and imprisonment, to serve the realm as penance. Gasps rippled through the hall. Tyrion's mouth fell open slightly, though he tried to conceal his shock. Grey Worm stiffened, his eyes blazing with silent protest. The Dornish envoy spat a quiet oath. Many had expected an immediate execution, a final, bloody conclusion to a villain's reign. But Daenerys seemed determined to chart a different course. Cersei blinked, uncertain if she had heard correctly. "You mean to banish me?" she asked, voice shaking with disbelief. "Not precisely," Daenerys said. "You will be taken to the ruins of the Dragonstone Keep, a place I know well. You will not be permitted to leave. The island is surrounded by water, treacherous currents, and a garrison of Unsullied. You will have the bare essentials: food, water, a roof over your head. But you will never set foot on the mainland again, never hold power again." Her voice trembled with a potent mix of anger and resolve. "That is my judgment. Live out your days remembering those you betrayed, those you killed, and the throne you lost. Let the realm know that we have not descended to barbarity, that we do not kill for pleasure or for a vengeful sense of justice. And let history judge whether this mercy was deserved." An uproar broke out among the assembled lords, some furious at the leniency, others quietly impressed that Daenerys was indeed forging a new path. Lord Royce bellowed for death. The Dornish envoy cursed in frustration, while Gendry wore a thoughtful frown. The flickers of tension crackled, threatening to turn the hall into a site of chaotic protest. Tyrion raised his hands, urging calm, while Grey Worm looked to Daenerys with an almost betrayed expression. But Daenerys stood firm. "Silence," she commanded. "Your queen has spoken. This is my judgment, and it is final. Anyone who would question it is free to do so. I do not rule by fear alone. But mark my words, I will not be swayed into more bloodshed. I have seen what war does to our realm. If we are to break the wheel, we must find a new way." The council had to abide by her decree. It was clear that many felt conflicted, but no one dared openly challenge the queen in that moment. Slowly, grudgingly, they fell into silence, each harboring their own reactions. Cersei herself looked stunned. She had expected death, or at least a lifetime in a black cell. But Dragonstone, the Targaryen ancestral seat, was a lonely place. She remembered Stannis Baratheon once calling it a dreary chamber of storms. She realized that Daenerys was offering her a slow, humiliating demise in isolation, exiled from the very land she once ruled. Whether that was better or worse than a swift beheading, Cersei could not immediately say. She squared her shoulders, grimacing at the pain in her leg. "If you think that rotting on an island is better than death, you are a fool." Daenerys's eyes flashed. "It is not for you. It is for the realm. Your life is no gift to me. You will endure powerless, so the people remember that even the mighty can fall." Cersei opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, the guards seized her. The council began to disperse, unsettled and abuzz with conversation. The crowd in the hall talked in hushed or angry tones, uncertain how to interpret this new brand of justice. But Daenerys held her ground, feeling Jon's presence at her side. When the hall had largely emptied, Tyrion approached her. His face was a mixture of relief, surprise, and an undercurrent of sorrow. "I didn't expect you to spare her," he admitted quietly. Daenerys exhaled, as though releasing an immense weight. "In the end, I couldn't find it in me to kill her after she was helpless. I don't deny she deserves death for what she's done, but that would solve nothing for the realm. It would only feed the cycle of vengeance. This is my way of showing we can be better." He nodded, then lowered his voice. "Thank you, Your Grace. For what it's worth, my brother might have wanted something like this, though I'm sure he would have found it lacking in poetry." A ghost of a smile crossed Daenerys's lips, tinged with sadness for the memory of Jaime Lannister's final attempt to save his sister. He died trying to protect her, didn't he? She said softly. Perhaps this is my way of giving his sacrifice some meaning. They walked from the hall, the memory of the trial already echoing through the keep. Outside, the sun shone pale through drifting clouds, and the battered city stirred with rumors. Some denounced the verdict as a sign of weakness in the new queen. Others hailed it as proof she was not mad, that she would not be the second coming of her father. The rumor mills churned, and Daenerys knew she had taken a risk, but a necessary one. That evening, Daenerys found Jon Snow in a quiet corner of the Red Keep, near a balcony that overlooked Blackwater Bay. She approached him softly, and he turned to meet her gaze. His eyes were fathomless as always, a swirl of unspoken devotion and lingering worry. That was a brave decision, he told her. Mercy rarely wins easy favor. She drew closer, resting her hand on the cold stone balustrade. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been easier just to kill her, she admitted. Then there would be no question of what my justice means. But I remember Meereen, Yunkai, Astapor, all the choices I made. I'm the breaker of chains, not a butcher. Jon placed a gentle hand on her arm. You did the right thing, he said quietly. The realm has seen enough beheadings, enough stabbings, battles, betrayals. We need to heal. Let them talk. Let them say what they will. In time, they'll see that you have a different path in mind. Daenerys looked at him, searching for sincerity. She found it, shining in his dark eyes. She placed her other hand gently atop his. Thank you, she said. I needed to hear that. He inclined his head, a small smile ghosting his lips. We have a lot of work to do. The city is still half in ruins, and the people are hungry. Winter might be on its last breath, but the scars remain. We need to rebuild, ensure order, and find a way to unite the Seven Kingdoms again. Your rule won't be simple. She laughed, a humorless sound tinged with both exhaustion and determination. Nothing about my journey has ever been simple, Jon. Together, they gazed out across the bay. The water shimmered in the twilight. In the distance, small fires still burned amid the wreckage of ships that had been destroyed in the final battle. But the sea, vast and ancient, seemed to promise a new horizon. Daenerys thought of her dragons. Rhaegal had been killed, but Drogon remained, a living symbol of her power, and of her capacity for both devastation and wonder. She could almost feel him roosting somewhere atop the Red Keep, watchful, fiercely loyal. The next day, preparations began to transport Cersei to Dragonstone. A small ship, escorted by the Unsullied, was readied at the harbor. The journey was short, but Cersei, still recovering from her injuries, would have to endure the sea crossing under strict guard. Grey Worm, upon Daenerys' direct orders, was to remain in King's Landing to help maintain order, and to ensure no further blood was shed. He disliked the idea of letting Cersei live, but he would not disobey his queen. Instead, he chose 10 of his best men to carry out the escort. When the time came, a hush fell over the harbor as the prisoner was brought forth. Cersei stood on the dock, her leg bound in a splint, her hair limp in the morning sun. Her wrists were chained before her. She refused to look at the crowd, though she could sense their stares. Some spat, others cursed her name, recalling how she once forced them to watch as she paraded through the streets with a lion's pride. Now she was the spectacle, humiliated, dethroned. The Unsullied escorted her up the gangplank and onto the waiting ship. Daenerys watched from a safe distance, flanked by Tyrion and Jon. She said nothing as Cersei was taken away, feeling a complicated mix of finality and uncertainty. Tyrion's face was unreadable, though occasionally she caught him glancing at the ship with a frown. She wondered if he worried for his sister's well-being, or if he questioned Daenerys' mercy. Perhaps both. As the ship hoisted sail, Cersei turned to cast a final look at King's Landing. The city that had once worshipped her, feared her, and ultimately cast her aside. Her expression was one of cold resignation, and, perhaps in the depths of her eyes, a flicker of sorrow. Then she retreated below deck, leaving the past behind with every pull of the oars. When the vessel disappeared around the headland, Daenerys let out a long breath. "It's done," she murmured. "Now we move forward." Jon took her hand for a moment, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Aye, let's see it done right." And so they set about the immense task of reconstruction. Daenerys convened a council of advisors to oversee the distribution of food, the rebuilding of homes, and the reorganization of the city's governance. Tyrion worked tirelessly, negotiating with merchants, enlisting skilled laborers, and ensuring the treasury was put to use for the common good. Davos, having returned from his mission, offered insights on trade routes and shipping, though the city's harbor needed significant repairs. Across the city, citizens gradually found the courage to step out of the wreckage. Some set up makeshift marketplaces, others offered their services in exchange for food or coin. The road ahead was long, and tensions still simmered. But day by day, the city began to pulse with a new spirit, not quite hopeful, but not entirely despairing either. Daenerys walked the streets often, sometimes accompanied by her guard, sometimes with only Missandei's memory for silent company. She recalled how her dear friend had once believed in her so fervently. The smell of ash lingered, but with each sunrise, the city grew a bit more alive. People saw their queen, walking among them without fear. They saw her helping to lift beams off a collapsed stall, speaking softly to a frightened child, ensuring that each newborn babe would one day learn the tale of the city that survived. In time, Sansa Stark journeyed south to witness the changes for herself. She arrived with a small retinue, wearing a cloak of direwolf fur and an expression of measured caution. Daenerys greeted her in the courtyard, the scene a stark contrast to their last meeting, when tensions ran high over the question of northern independence. Sansa inclined her head politely. "Your Grace," she said. Daenerys noticed that Sansa's tone was no longer openly hostile. "Lady Stark," she replied. "Welcome to King's Landing." Sansa surveyed the city, her keen eyes taking in the battered walls, the signs of reconstruction, and the men and women working under the new Queen's banner. "I have heard surprising stories about how you took King's Landing, and how you spared it." Daenerys offered a faint smile. "The people here have endured enough. I won't pretend there isn't still fear, still anger, but I'm trying to govern with a gentler hand." Sansa nodded thoughtfully, then lowered her voice so only Daenerys could hear. "I'm sorry for what happened to Missandei, and for the losses you suffered in this war." Daenerys's eyes flickered. She hadn't expected sympathy from Sansa, who had once been so openly mistrustful. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know you lost many of your own. Perhaps we can work together to ensure we don't have any more pointless deaths." Sansa considered her for a moment, then extended a hand. "For the good of the realm." Daenerys took it, and for the first time, there was no tension in the gesture, only a mutual understanding that the time for petty rivalries had passed. Time rolled on, and in the following weeks new tensions arose. Some lords demanded that Daenerys punish the remnants of Cersei's loyalists more severely. Others claimed that the city was not safe so long as there were men and women who had served the old regime wandering free. Daenerys' stance remained consistent. Justice when necessary, but no mass reprisals. She would not begin her reign by purging the city's populace on suspicion alone. She refused to emulate the cruelty of the Mad King. Not everyone was satisfied. Small pockets of resistance emerged, those who hated Targaryens, those who had lost loved ones in the final battle. A few scrawled graffiti on walls. "The dragon has two faces." Unsullied patrols occasionally clashed with agitators who threw stones or tried to incite riots. But so far, the city did not erupt into open rebellion. Fear, exhaustion, and perhaps a glimmer of hope stayed most hands. Cersei's name, however, was rarely spoken among the common folk, except as a cautionary tale or a curse. Word spread that she had been banished to Dragonstone, left to rot in her own bitterness, guarded by the silent Unsullied. Rumors circulated that she paced the halls like a caged lioness, cursing Daenerys' name. Some said she spent her days gazing at the sea, awaiting a rescue that would never come. Others whispered that she was plotting some last, desperate gambit. But no word came from Dragonstone. No ravens, no letters, only silence. On a crisp morning, when the wind carried the salt tang from Blackwater Bay, Daenerys made her way to the harbor. She dressed simply, her hair pulled back in braids, wearing a cloak against the chill. Tyrion and Davos accompanied her, discussing a proposal for increased trade with Essos. The trio paused near a spot where children played by the water's edge, chasing each other with wooden swords and sticks they pretended were dragons. Daenerys watched them for a moment, recalling her own childhood, what little of it she had. She felt a pang of longing for all that had been lost in the years of flight, war, and struggle. "We need to secure better relations with the free cities," Tyrion was saying. "Now that the war has ended, perhaps they can sell us grain at a favorable rate. That might help feed King's Landing until the next harvest." Davos nodded. We can send envoys. My time as a smuggler taught me a thing or two about trade routes. Of course, we need coin to pay for those shipments." Daenerys tore her gaze from the children. "We'll find the coin. We still have the royal treasury. And once we establish peace across Westeros, we can collect taxes again. Fairly this time. The people will grumble, but they'll see the benefits if we use that coin to rebuild." They strolled along, passing rows of ships in various states of repair. Daenerys paused by a large vessel with the Targaryen sigil newly painted on the sail. She recalled the uncertainty of crossing the narrow sea to reclaim her birthright, the hopes and fears that had filled her heart. Now that dream was realized. She held King's Landing, was recognized as queen, yet she felt the weight of it pressing down every moment. "We have a chance," she told Tyrion and Davos quietly, "to rebuild the realm into something better. I won't pretend it will be easy or that I won't make mistakes. But I can't do this alone." Tyrion bowed his head. "You have my counsel, always. I once believed in a different queen. Now I believe in you. Let's make something worthwhile out of all this wreckage." Davos placed a hand over his heart. "You have the support of the Onion Knight, Your Grace. We've all seen enough war for one lifetime." For the first time in what felt like ages, Daenerys allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Thank you both. Let's give the next generation something other than war and tyranny to inherit." The next few months were spent in a frenzy of rebuilding. Daenerys and her council delegated tasks to local leaders, encouraging them to form small councils within each district of King's Landing to oversee repairs. She introduced a new system of justice, encouraging the people to bring forth their grievances. Tyrion worked to resolve old feuds, awarding compensation in the form of land or coin where possible. Slowly, the city began to stand on its own feet again. Pockets of green began to dot the capital as small gardens were tended on rooftops and in courtyards. Smiths fired up their forges to craft tools instead of weapons. Children who had cowered in bunkers now roamed the streets, playing games in half-rebuilt squares. Though scars remained and the memory of war lingered, there was an undercurrent of cautious optimism. The people did not forget the dragon overhead, but so far, the dragon remained perched and did not rain fire upon them. During this period, Jon Snow made regular trips to the north, ensuring his people were not neglected. He returned each time, reporting on the conditions there, the fortification of the neck, and the rifts that still needed mending. But his presence in King's Landing became more frequent, and he stood at Daenerys' side often, whether in the war room or at ceremonial gatherings to welcome diplomats. A quiet understanding existed between them, one that transcended titles and bloodlines. Amidst this relative peace, the memory of Cersei's trial began to fade into a footnote. It was overshadowed by the daily reality of rebuilding an entire realm. Yet no matter how many days passed, Daenerys could not quite banish the memory of Cersei's chained figure in the Great Hall. She wondered if she had done the right thing, sparing a life drenched in blood, condemning the woman to a slow, solitary existence. But each time she questioned herself, she thought of the children running about in the streets, the fields of grain that would feed them, and the possibility that the cycle of violence might yet be broken. In Dragonstone, Cersei paced the halls. She awoke each morning to the crash of waves and the cries of gulls. Her leg healed slowly, leaving her with a permanent limp. The unsullied station there gave her no kindness, no cruelty, only silent vigilance. She was allowed a small library, though it contained mostly histories of Targaryen conquest and tomes on dragon lore. She had a modest chamber with a bed, a table, and a single window overlooking the sea. Each day, she saw a storm gather or pass, the gloom of clouds overshadowing the castle. When storms lashed at the walls, she felt the salt spray and wind that rattled the glass panes. She could only imagine the realm beyond, the one she had lost. She spent her days in simmering resentment. The notion of penance did not touch her heart. She blamed Daenerys, Tyrion, even Jaime for abandoning her. She cursed them all. Yet as the weeks dragged on, and no rescue came, she began to realize that perhaps there was no one left to save her. No golden armies, no cunning spymasters. Euron Greyjoy was dead. Qyburn was dead. Her father and sons all gone. Her only living son, if he could be called that, had been lost when she took the crown for herself. She was alone. Sometimes, she would stand at the window for hours, remembering a prophecy told to her when she was young, that she would be cast down by a queen younger and more beautiful. She raged that the prophecy had been right, though Daenerys was not the golden-haired rival she had once imagined. And yet, if she truly believed in that prophecy, she would also remember the Valonqar, little brother, would wrap his hands around her pale white throat. But it was not Tyrion who ended her, nor Jaime. She lived, but in a prison of storm and stone. Her throat unchoked, but her spirit was weighed down by isolation. Summer slowly approached, the snows receded, and in King's Landing, new buildings rose from the ashes. The markets bustled again. Daenerys began receiving ambassadors from across the narrow sea. Her reputation grew as a queen who had ended war without fully razing the capital, who had chosen to spare her greatest enemy. Some questioned her decisiveness, but others admired her moral conviction. Reports came that Dorne was entering negotiations to formalize an alliance, that the Vale would open more trade routes, that the North would remain separate but cooperative. Sansa Stark, now titled Warden of the North, recognized Daenerys' sovereignty while retaining near autonomy for her people. The realm was not the same as it had been under the Baratheons or Targaryens of old, but perhaps it was something new, an alliance of regions, each with a measure of independence, bound by the shared hope of peace. Those who had prayed for an end to tyranny saw a glimmer of fulfillment in Daenerys Targaryen. Those who doubted her still watched her warily, recalling her destructive potential. Daenerys herself felt the tension of these perspectives, striving each day to prove worthy of trust, to show that she was not her father's daughter in cruelty, but in legacy alone. She sat upon the Iron Throne for official ceremonies, but often joked to Tyrion that it was the most uncomfortable chair she had ever known, made of 1,000 swords indeed. Outside of those ceremonies, she spent little time on the throne, preferring to walk among her people, or to plan policy in the smaller council chambers. Over time, the story of Cersei Lannister's downfall became a lesson taught to the children of King's Landing. They heard how a queen who ruled by fear and deception was overthrown not by an equally cruel conqueror, but by one who chose a different path. Some said that Daenerys was wise and just. Others said that she was naive to spare a viper like Cersei. Whispers persisted that one day, the exiled lioness might slip her cage. But as the city flourished, these doubts became background noise to the hum of commerce and daily life. When Daenerys felt certain that the city could manage itself, she ventured forth to visit each kingdom, forging alliances. She traveled to the Riverlands, where she met with Edmure Tully, who had reclaimed Riverrun. She traveled north to Winterfell, where she and Sansa had careful discussions on how best to share resources. She journeyed to Dorne, forging a pact that recognized their independence but promised mutual defense. Through it all, she carried herself not as a conqueror demanding fealty, but as a queen seeking partnership. Some bristled at this new dynamic, preferring the old hierarchical order. Others embraced it, seeing an opportunity to exert local power. Yet the general consensus was that peace was more profitable and less deadly than war. Back in King's Landing, the repairs advanced at a miraculous pace. The Targaryen banners flew from the ramparts, but the people no longer cowered at the sight of them. Instead, they saw them as a herald of a new era. The throne room was restored, though Daenerys insisted on removing some of the more oppressive symbols. She had the skulls of old dragons relocated to a new crypt, believing it was time to stop flaunting them as instruments of intimidation. The city guard, now reorganized under a new commander, patrolled the streets to maintain order rather than bully the populace. The Red Keep became a place of governance and learning, with libraries, small council chambers, and offices for the distribution of aid. All these transformations did not mean the realm was free of strife. Bandits still roamed the roads. Lawless pockets erupted here and there. Some lords challenged the new queen's authority, testing her limits. But Daenerys confronted each challenge with a mixture of resolve and negotiation. Where bandits threatened travelers, she dispatched her forces, capturing or scattering them. Where lords refused to pay taxes or abide by her laws, she summoned them to court, hearing their grievances. If they refused, she imposed calculated economic measures rather than unleashing her dragons. Only in the rarest of cases did she consider using Drogon as a final deterrent, and she did so sparingly. In this way, the realm experienced a fragile peace that it had not known in years. People began to speak of King's Landing not as a den of corruption, but as the seat of a queen who balanced fire with mercy. Some said that only time would tell if Daenerys would remain so measured. But for now, the war was over, and she had shown no signs of the cruelty that many had feared. Eventually, Daenerys called for a grand gathering in the capital to commemorate the official end of Reconstruction. She invited the lords of the Seven Kingdoms, or however many considered themselves under her protection, and foreign dignitaries from Essos. Tents and pavilions were erected outside the city walls. Music and laughter filled the streets for the first time in a generation. People came by the hundreds, sampling new food stalls, dancing to the rhythms of drums and fiddles. Jugglers, puppeteers, and musicians performed in squares that had once been the site of mass executions. On the final day of celebrations, Daenerys appeared before the crowds in a ceremonial but modest gown. She stood on a stage erected in the courtyard of the Red Keep, flanked by Jon Snow, Tyrion, and several other advisors. Grey Worm stood a short distance away, ever watchful, though his harsh bitterness had eased somewhat, replaced by a solemn resolve to fulfill Missandei's final wish, that Daenerys would succeed in building a better world. Daenerys addressed the crowd, her voice carrying with practiced clarity, "People of King's Landing, people of Westeros, we have come a long way from the fires of war. We have lost friends, loved ones, our homes. But from the ashes we have built something new. My promise to you remains. I seek no vengeance upon those who once opposed me. I seek no further bloodshed. I only ask that we continue to stand together, to reject the cruelty that has plagued us for too long. If we hold fast to the ideals of justice, mercy, and cooperation, we can break the wheel that has ground the common folk into dust for centuries." A rousing cheer went up, not universal but still spirited. Daenerys paused, letting the moment wash over her. She remembered standing in front of liberated slaves in Essos, hearing them chant her name. That memory, once so uplifting, now felt tempered by the knowledge of what it took to get here. She glanced at Tyrion, who looked proud, and then at Jon, who offered a small nod of approval. When the cheers subsided, Daenerys raised a hand. "There will be disputes and challenges ahead. We are not perfect, and nor is our world. But we have a chance now, a chance to forge a kinder future." She lowered her hand, her expression softening. "Let us seize that chance." The applause thundered again, echoing off the newly repaired walls. Banners fluttered, trumpets sounded. The festival continued, with feasting and dancing long into the night. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the spirit of unity could indeed triumph over old grudges. That night, Daenerys found a quiet moment to slip away from the revelry. She climbed a familiar stairwell to a small balcony that overlooked the city. The sky was dotted with stars, and a crescent moon cast a silver glow over the rooftops. From here, she saw King's Landing in a rare moment of celebration. Lanterns bobbing in the darkness, laughter drifting upward like the echo of a dream. Jon came upon her, his boots scuffing the stone steps. She turned slightly, acknowledging his presence with a gentle smile. Together they stood at the rail side by side, gazing at the city. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Daenerys asked quietly. Letting her live? She didn't need to say Cersei's name. She could feel the memory of the dethroned queen haunting the corners of her mind. Jon considered her question, gazing at the distant flickers of torchlight. "I do," he answered. "Not because she deserved it, but because it showed the realm what kind of queen you are." She nodded, a hint of relief crossing her face. "She might still hate me, plot against me, but on that island, she can do little." "A living symbol of what came before," Jon said. "A reminder of tyranny. And you are the opposite. A reminder that mercy can lead to something better." Daenerys let out a soft breath. "Perhaps." She turned to face him, the lamplight reflecting in her violet eyes. "Will you stay, Jon? Here in King's Landing?" He hesitated. "The North still needs me from time to time, but Sansa is more than capable. She leads them well. It's not my place to rule as king, but I'll keep traveling north and south, bridging the gap." He paused, then added quietly, "You are my queen." She looked at him with a measured gratitude. There was a time when his words of devotion filled her with giddy hope. Now it was a steady comfort, a partnership forged in fire. She reached up and gently touched his cheek. "Thank you, Jon Snow, for believing in me." He leaned into her touch for a moment, then turned his gaze back to the city. Together, they stood there for a long while, listening to the distant echoes of music and celebration, the hush of the night wind, and the beating of their own hearts. In the days that followed, life in King's Landing continued its slow journey toward normalcy. The trial of Cersei Lannister became a story told at taverns and hearths. How the great lioness was caged by a queen with dragons but was spared from death. Some would claim Daenerys was a fool for letting such an enemy live. Others would see in her actions a break with the cycle of cruelty that had defined the realm for so long. And somewhere across the sea, on the lonely island of Dragonstone, Cersei Lannister woke each morning to the sound of crashing waves and the cry of seabirds. Sometimes, she imagined she heard Jaime's voice in the wind, calling to her from a place she could never follow. She would stand by the window, feeling the cold breeze on her face, remembering the days when she held a kingdom in her grip. Now she held nothing but regret and bitterness. Her heart seethed with silent rage, plotting escapes that were impossible, cursing a queen who was out of reach. And so she lived on, day by day, her own thoughts her only companions. In King's Landing, Daenerys Targaryen continued to rule, striving to balance the memory of all she had lost with the hope of what she could build. The city was not perfect. It bore scars of war and corruption that would take generations to mend, but it was alive. Through her choices, Daenerys had lit a spark of possibility in the eyes of her subjects, a spark that might grow into a flame of true renewal. The realm was fragile, united in name only, but it was not drowning in blood. It breathed, it reached for tomorrow, and it dared to dream that the wheel might, at last, be broken. In that dream lay the essence of what Daenerys hoped to achieve. A realm not governed by fear, but guided by a measured hand, forging a new identity from the broken pieces of the old. And so time moved forward, carrying the realm with it, shaping the legends and songs yet to be written, songs of a queen who chose mercy over fire, a city that rose from ashes, and a land that reached, however tentatively, toward a more hopeful horizon.